The night Marco found out, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, her phone cradled in her hands. I was taking off my nursing clogs in the hallway after a 12-hour shift, and I barely noticed her. Like me, she fell silent when she was tired, but this silence was different. She wasn't scrolling, she wasn't moving, she was just reading. She looked up after I said her name twice. There was no anger on her face. That's what I remember most. It was something worse, that blank expression people get when something they half suspected turns out to be absolutely true. As if the floor hadn't just moved, it was no longer there. "Come on, sit down," she said. I set my bag down on the counter and sat down across from her. She handed me the phone without saying a word. It was a text chain. His cousin Renata had forwarded it, screenshots of screenshots, a messy thread that took a while to understand. At the very top, Renata had written, "Marco, I'm sorry. I should have shown you this a long time ago. I didn't know things had gotten this bad." I started reading. The conversation was between Renata's mother, Aunt Gloria, and Diane, Marco's mother, my mother-in-law of 7 years, the woman who cried at our wedding and called me her daughter in front of the entire reception. The timestamps were about 3 years ago. In one message, Diane was describing a photo of a receipt she'd pulled from my purse, a cash withdrawal she'd claimed to have seen me make and then lied to Marco about. She had the amount, the date, the name of the bank, all of it. She wrote, "I'll bring it up casually so it looks like I just noticed. He should start asking where the girl's money goes." Gloria wrote back, "Are you sure about this, Diane?" And Diane, "I've never been more sure of anything. He's not right for her. I see things he doesn't see." I stopped reading. My hands were flat on the table and I could feel the rough texture of the ceramic beneath my palms. For 3 years, I'd wondered why Marco would sometimes suddenly pull away from me, why he'd ask strange questions about our joint account, or why he'd bring up a weekend when I worked a double shift with a wary, measured look in his eyes. I blamed the stress. I blamed my own insecurities. I sat across from Diane at Sunday dinner and helped her carry the dishes to the sink and thought, at least she was on my side. At least he was on my side. Marco was watching me read. I looked up and saw him clutching his cold coffee mug as if it were the only solid thing. "How long ago was this?" I asked. "Keep scrolling," he said. I did. The thread was over 3 years old. As I looked through them, the timestamps were blurring, references to familiar things, moments from our marriage that I could remember clearly. In my second year, Marco and I had a fight that had suddenly erupted over something that I hadn't understood until now. A time when his sister had been cold to me for months, and then suddenly everything was back to normal, as if a switch had been flipped. Little, strange cracks that I had never been able to explain. Now they were explained. Each one had a name attached to it, and that name was Diane. Marco and I met the way people met in the old days, through acquaintances, at a birthday party in a mutual friend's backyard, standing in line for the same warm potato salad. He made me laugh twice before he even introduced himself. We dated for 2 years, got married in a small ceremony in his aunt's garden, and by the 3rd year we had built something I was truly proud of, a house we painted ourselves, a routine that was our own, not our own, a marriage where we sat on the couch together even when we didn't speak. I worked long shifts as a nurse at a busy regional hospital. Marco handled logistics for a mid-sized construction company. Our work hours didn't always match, but we found time to find each other. Friday dinners. Saturday mornings are for sitting on the back steps drinking coffee. We weren't the perfect couple. We fought over money, dishes, and whose turn it was to call the plumber. But our foundation was solid. I believed in it the way I believed in things I could touch. Diane had been a part of our relationship from the beginning. She was the kind of sincere woman some women are in public, the kind of sincere woman who looks so good in pictures. She hugged me at every event, called me sweetheart, and once stayed up until midnight to help set up Marco's surprise birthday party. At church, she would press her hands to her chest as if she were saying it from her heart and introduce me to her friends as her daughter-in-law. The initial disagreement was so minor that I had been interpreting it differently for years. He would make comments that struck me as odd, and I would think about them on the way home, trying to figure out if I had heard him wrong. Like a joke about nurses meeting a lot of interesting people at work, a joke that was a bit too much. A light mention of a woman Marco had been in a relationship with before, just her name, casually, and always a light smile. Nothing I could talk about directly, nothing that would hold up if I said it verbally. At first, when I tried to talk to Marco about it, he would be really shocked. He would say, "That's how he talks, he loves you." And because I loved him and wanted to believe it, I would convince myself that he knew him better than I did. I tried harder. I would bring food to family dinners. I remembered his sister's birthdays. I sat next to him on weekends and asked about his garden, his church committee, and his oldest friend Elaine's hip surgery. I worked to get his approval the way people work to get something from their hearts, relentlessly, without any pretense of effort. Looking back, it seems like that part of me silently broke something inside me, not what he was doing, but what I was doing in response to him, wrapping myself up, adapting, acting, trying to find my place in a family to which I was already legally attached. I didn't know I was being controlled. I felt like I was being slowly welcomed, which, from my perspective, felt the same. Sunday dinner kept coming. The dishes kept being carried to the sink. Diane would tap me on the shoulder on the way back to the table, and for a moment I thought that whatever I was worrying about was actually my own oversensitivity. It was easy to reassure me then. The first thing I learned later, not then, not even close to then, was about the letters. My mother, who still did everything by hand, would send cards. Birthday cards, wedding anniversary cards, and a card for passing the nursing board exam, which I had kept in the drawer next to my bed for years. But I didn't keep them all because I only got a few of them. The rest had gone elsewhere. I don't know exactly how long it took Diane to figure out that my mother wrote to my home address instead of my cell phone, but once she did, she put it to good use. She would pick up the letters from the mailbox before I got home from work. I imagine her standing at the end of the driveway in her cardigan, opening the envelopes and reading what my mother had written. I imagine her making a decision about each letter. Much later, I learned that what she had told Marco was that my mother had written something that had worried her. The writing was strange. It said there was a card about money I had borrowed without telling her. She showed Marco a card that I later learned wasn't the real card, something she had written herself or altered, the full process of which I still don't know. As far as I know, around the second year, Marco started asking me if my family's finances were okay, if my mother were in trouble, if I ever felt like I had to handle something without telling her. The question struck me as odd. I answered honestly, no, of course not. We had moved forward with the matter, but the seed had been planted by then. That was how she worked. She didn't mess around. She just planted seeds and waited and tended them very quietly while I sat next to her at dinner and asked about Elaine's hip pain. There was a time, maybe about 6 months into third year, when Marco's cousin Renata stopped inviting me to any events. Girls' lunches, birthday parties, and the kind of intimate gatherings that don't require group messaging, but somehow everyone knows about. I noticed it the way you can sense a crisp breeze before you find an open window. Something was off, but I couldn't find the source. When I told Marco, he said Renata was probably just busy. When I told Diane, she tilted her head in a mock sympathy manner and said, "Renata says funny things sometimes, don't take it personally." I didn't take it personally. I was too busy believing her at the time. What I didn't know was that Diane had told Renata that I had made a comment about her, a very harsh one, so cruel to be believable yet so vague that it was hard to disprove. What the comment was, I don't know. I never learned the exact words. All I know is that by the fourth year, there were 3 or 4 people in that family who treated me in a cold way that I couldn't explain. And for 3 or 4 years, I had assumed, without realizing it, that I had made a mistake. So I tried harder. That was my old trick. Try harder, be more sincere, and be more present. Diane would watch me do it. Every Sunday, she would see how I was working to close the gap that she had created, and she had no intention of ever letting me close it. And I looked at her across the table and smiled, and she smiled too. That was the 4th year. We still had 3 years left. Marco found the diary one Thursday. I didn't know he was looking for it. I didn't know there was anything to find, but Diane had one, a small spiral-bound notebook that she kept tucked away in the back of the kitchen drawer, among the takeout menus and expired coupons. Marco went to Diane's house to fix a leaky pipe under her sink, and while he was looking for the shut-off valve, the drawer opened completely and the notebook fell to the floor. He sat in her kitchen for 2 hours reading it. Diane wasn't home. He called me before he drove there. I remember him telling me to stay home, saying he had to run some errands first and he'd come back and explain everything. His voice had become calm in a way I'd never heard before. Not angry, not broken, just something slipping. "You're going to have to trust me for a few more hours," he said. I said I would. I meant it. He drove to his office where he was having lunch with a friend. He waited in the parking lot. When he came out and saw her, she smiled. That instinct, that smile, had worked on him all his life. Later he told me that it had almost worked again. His chest twisted with that familiar feeling, that familiar pull toward her, the longing of a son for his mother for 38 years, and then he thought of the notebook, and the pull stopped. "We need to talk," he said. He offered to go inside for coffee. She said no. He held up the notebook. At first his smile didn't change. He said he could explain it all. He said he didn't understand the whole thing. He said he had been protecting her. From what? He asked. From Sara. Then he stirred. He told her I had changed her. She told him that I had taken him away from his family, from him, that I had prioritized my career over giving him grandchildren, that there were things about me that he had sensed from the beginning that he had never been able to put into words. A mother, she said, understood. Marco told her what he had really done. He started telling her everything. The lies he had told Renata, his manipulation of financial documents, his wiretapped messages. Over the years, I had watched him try to close the distance he had only increased. He told it all as if he had been in the kitchen reading credentials for 2 hours and felt the need to say each thing out loud to prove it. Diane began to cry. Later, he told me that when she told him, he had expected to feel something. Maybe relief or guilt or that old familiar urge to make things right for him. He felt none of it. He was tired. "I love you," he told her, "but I don't trust you, and until this changes, you can't get near my wife." The girl said she was overreacting. She said Sara had finally turned him on, which was what Sara had always wanted. She said she hoped he would think about what he was giving up. She said she had thought about it for 2 hours in her kitchen, and then she got in her car. She came home and sat down next to me on the couch, and she put the notebook on the coffee table between us and said, "Tell me everything you've never told me to protect my feelings," so I did. It took 3 nights. That first night, we barely slept. I told her about that Christmas when Diane had taken me aside and said that she had heard that I was unhappy in this marriage, that people were talking about me, and that maybe I should think about whether this was the life I really wanted. I had been in a quandary for weeks after that, wondering who these people were or what I had done to give the impression that they were. Marco listened with his jaw set and his hands folded in his lap, as if he were deliberately holding himself still. I told her about money, how I had started a separate savings account, not to hide anything from him, but because Diane had once mentioned, very casually as if it were common knowledge, that I had been careless with the joint account. I had spent months doubting my own memory of what I had spent and why. I showed her my accounts. Every deposit, every transfer, every receipt that I had kept, because some quiet part of me always knew that I might have to prove myself someday. He stared at the spreadsheet for a long time but said nothing. Finally, he said, "You've built a foundation for years in case I turned against you." I didn't deny it. He closed the laptop. "It's my fault too. I made you feel like you needed it." We weren't okay after that first night. I want to be clear about this. Saying the words didn't solve the problem. We were both sitting in a marriage structure that was only held together by habit and persistence, and we had to figure out if there was a foundation to build on. Some mornings, I'd watch him get his coffee and wonder if he was looking at me and doing the same calculation. The counselor we started seeing in February had a way of asking questions that felt like the ground was moving underfoot. Not cruel, just specific. He once asked me what I needed from Marco to feel safe in this marriage, and I said I didn't know anymore, and he said that's where we could start. Honesty about not knowing, we started from there. The boundaries with Diane were unbreakable. Marco told his sisters and aunts the reason, without any personal opinions, just the truth. Renata called me and cried for 20 minutes and apologized. I told her I didn't blame her. I meant it. Diane used everyone around her. Renata was just closer to the source. Her aunts were quiet about it, as older women sometimes are when there's no clear villain in a family story they can blow up. They knew Diane. They knew what she could do. I think some of them always knew. Diane sent Marco a letter in March. I didn't read it. She summed it up in one sentence. She still believed he was protecting her. She filed the letter away and didn't reply. There's a version of this story where I tell you forgiveness was easy, where the marriage snapped back into place like a rubber band and everything we'd lost came back silently. But that wasn't the case. What was happening was slower and less dramatic, and sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, I would feel the old fear flowing through me like a current. The fear that I was still missing something, that the ground beneath my feet would cave in again. But then Marco would do something small. He would refill my coffee without saying anything. He would hold my hand during a difficult phone call. He would look at me from across a room full of people, just as he had done before, as if I were the steady center around which he oriented himself. And I would feel the current flowing.